In the secret world of dog fighting competitions, one name stood out above all. Earl Tudor became known, not only for raising dogs, but he shaped true champions. His bloodlines dominated the arenas, and his fame crossed borders. Earl Tudor was not just a creator. His dogs were known for their endurance, strength, and determination. They were feared and respected by all. It is said that if a Pitbull came from the line of Tudor, the victory was almost certain. The Oklahoma Boy. Reports by Don Mayfield. April 1982. In 1951, after nearly 100 years of breeding Pitbull dogs in the United States, the Pitbull reached a peak. In Arizona, a male named Bouncer was crossed with a female named Bambi by a man named Ed Ritcheson. In the litter was a red dog with a dark blue snout. This dog was bred from American fighting dogs. Since he was a puppy, he was raised and named by a black man. He was called Dabo. In the region of Africa, the word Dabo means devil. In his pedigree, there were more than 100 years of fighting dogs, which were bred in the United States region. These dogs were proven in the ring. His family was the most crusade in the world of struggle. The Pitbull Dabo and his entire family were produced by no American creation. They were everywhere in the United States. The American game dogs of the Dabo pedigree were dogs that proved their gameness. Inside the ring in America, these Pitbull dogs arrived in our country in the mid-1800s. They came from the region of Europe. Some of the Pitbull dogs that were brought to our nation were from raising different families from England, Ireland, and Scotland. They were created together in their nations, so they were imported into our nation and crossed with the Pitbulls from another family. These dogs were being challenged against each other to prove which was the most competitive family. Men like Cockney, Charlie, and Lloyd imported dogs from no English family and crossed them with our nation's English breeding. These men had few dogs, but proved that their breeding was the most fighting. At the end of 1800, early 1900s, Comfeely, who had already put many dogs to fight, became a breeder of different English families. They were created in the United States. F.G. Henry imported some English red dogs and crossed them with Lord Comfeely's successful dog family. After a while, the English dogs were being put into combat, being tried and crossed on the north coast of our nation, and the Irish families were doing the same way in the East Coast region. J.P. Colby was a man who crossed different families from Pitbull. He crossed Irish dogs from the north coast with dogs from the east coast. Several different men put their dogs for a duel and proved the courage of their breeding. These dogs were being selected in dog fighting. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, the Irish dogs were the ones that were proving to have the most gameness, and they arrived in Texas in Bill Shipley's backyard. The Bill imported no Irish dog family and crossed it with no Irish dog family, which had been raised in the United States. In the early 1900s, the name that would be famous in the world of Pitbull's struggle would be Earl Tudor. Until then, the most famous man in combat was the Dogmen Comfeely of Illinois. Then, in 1908, a man named Earl Tudor appeared. He was from Oklahoma City. Earl Tudor was the man who put dogs to fight the most, and who proved gameness with his dogs the most, much more than any other man in his time. He crossed the families of F.G. Henry with the families of Comfeely. By the late 1930s, by the early 1940s, Earl Tudor was proving that his dog breeding was the best. At that time, he crossed the dogs, which were proven inside the ring. They were English breeding dogs, crossed with the Irish family of Bill Shipley. It was about 320 kilometers from him in the city of Texas. This brought together the Pitbulls that were created in the north with the Pitbulls that were created in the east. As far as the center of the US, Earl Tudor proved to have the best gameness dogs in the US in the 1940s. In the early 1950s, Earl Tudor was in Arizona observing a breeding of dogs. He was taken to see a dog named Dabo. Earl Tudor liked this dog very much, so he took the dog back with him to Oklahoma. At first, he called this dog Red Runt, but then he called it Dabo again. Earl Tudor crossed the Dabo with several females from his own family of dogs. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, Earl Tudor closed a line of dogs. Their dogs were different from dogs which were bred in the United States. His family was the nucleus, with almost every other creation in the United States. It is merged in Earl Tudor's backyard. In the year 1960 until the early 1970s, Earl Tudor developed his lineage of American game dogs. This family of dogs were all similar. From 1960 until the late 1970s, Earl Tudor's dogs were the ones that most proved gameness. Earl Tudor proved with his dogs more than any other man of his time that it was, even before the fight was illegal. Today, in the early 1980s, society around the world is looking for a family of excellent fighting dogs. Here in Texas, on top of a mountain next to a long creek, we bred selected dogs from a ring. No American Pitbull family that proved their gameness. In recent years, we have had few dogs from this family. Several nations were looking for a family of Pitbull dogs with the best proven fighting dogs in several nations. These dogs were crossed with the understanding of different men, with a unique goal, which was to extract gameness. At the same time, Paul Harvey told a journalist, "Today the population believes that a dog has spirit and that they go to heaven. I'm a man from Texas who has spent more than 20 years looking into the inside of these dogs. I believe that dogs harbor the spirit and soul of the devil, and they are becoming man's best friend. Here in the United States, where dogs of different strains are born, we are the most gameness dog breeders raised in the world. Here in Texas, we raise a family of American game dogs, which go so far as to be a gameness. And these dogs are suitable for only 3 types of people. These 3 types of people are: 1. The people who feed them, 2. People protected by a saint, and 3. A people with faith in the devil himself. Those with a saint, the dogs will be frightened. They will jump on his lap and they will lick his whole face. But when a man of little faith comes face to face with this kind of dog, dogs bred to fight, this man is in great danger. These dogs were afraid of those who are more like saints, and will turn their heads away. I watched many fighting dogs as they looked into the eyes of several men whom I met in our time. I also looked at the men when they looked at these dogs. This story I write for you, who are looking for a game dog, comes with my experience. I've been involved over the last 25 years with fighting dogs and with betting men, and I've been a lover of both. In my eyes, the most fighting man who was created was our Lord Jesus. He is a man of God and of humanity, and was sacrificed on the cross, not to tell a little lie. That is faith, and the spirit of a gameness. On no autumn morning in 1961, I went to visit Earl Tudor at his home in Oklahoma. We had a female with us. She was the daughter of her own family of dogs. We went to meet him and talk about the reproduction of this female. We talked a lot, so we crossed the female. After that, we drove almost 400 kilometers back to our home in Texas. In the following years, We returned several times to Earl Tudor's house. On one visit, I remember sitting on a couch with Earl Tudor, and I have blue eyes and he always wanted me to sit next to him, so he could look into my eyes as we talked. We almost always talk about creation, always trying to look each other's eye. We had our own ways of understanding ourselves. We taught each other what we had already done and what we were doing. But when it came to talking about reproduction, I only asked questions. I remember once that Earl Tudor, in his 60s, started crying a lot when he told me, "These damn businessmen with dogs who steal the credit of other dogmen. I was never given a little credit for my dogs." Then he would wipe away the tears from his eyes, put his glasses back on, fixate on my face and say, "It's all in the Don reproduction. Everything in the reproduction." So he would tell me about the dogs. He would tell me about these pure dogs. They were family bred dogs without being mixed, pure dogs. So I asked Earl Tudor, what was the best dog you had? He raised his head, and his wife said, "The best dogs Earl Tudor had were from the old dog Henry. He never lost a fight with this dog Henry. Isn't he, Earl Tudor?" And Earl Tudor, with a smile on his face, said ... "You're right. The dogs of old Henry's family were red-eyed dogs and were gameiness animals. The eyes were red like the eyes of a raccoon. They had a large mouth, with a lot of muscles in their head. Most were black, but some were white and some were red-nosed dogs. He told me that all Henry dogs could bite hard and were very wild, both to fight and to train. And like no Oklahoma preacher, he would scream in the middle of the night. He knelt on the ground and said ... They were dogs of deep gameiness, of English origin. I sat there on the couch with that strange Earl Tudor scream and thought, don't irritate him, don't say anything, he's wild in his sadness. Suddenly he got up and hid his pain. He went back to his place and said, "They were good, Don. He was like a wild black stallion." And then his wife said, "He was as fragile as a brown." Earl Tudor's love for Pitbull dogs was like such a great mountain. And we sat for hours and talked non-stop. With the stars shining in the sky, he looked directly into my eyes and said, "So, if I could, I'd go back in time, on days when it wasn't anyone's business, and that you did what you wanted." So he told me about Dabo, Demon, Black Jack Jr., his father and his mother. He told me, "Don, 20 years ago here in Oklahoma it was hard to survive. He put the dogs to fight and we also put on roosters to survive. In the 1930s, men still picked up no Indian woman to get married. When the dust cloud came, many people and dogs moved to California to become farmers. At that time, we had 3 rangers in our house. He would put dogs and roosters to fight every week, and that was for many years. Then he told me that he had been shot 6 times by 6 different men and never went to the hospital. And that was the doctor who went to his house. Once his brother-in-law shot him and he didn't go to the doctor. He said he covered the hole from which the bullet came and covered where it came out. He said, at that time, we had 7 dogs almost ready. They were being prepared for a week. He said he ran in the field with the dogs. He said that at that time, there were no fences and it was just open ground. And that had a lot of sand, with a chair that was spinning. We prepared 7 dogs around this chair. I had a long fishing rod with a tail tied to a line. He did 2 or 3 sets of dogs from dog to dog, while the others trained at carpet mill. Earl Tudor said he didn't have a treadmill at that time, and that if he had one, he wouldn't use it. Carpet mill was the best for working a dog. I told him yes and that I knew, because I had one in my backyard. So he would look me in the eye and say, "Tell me how you train them." and I would start talking and tell him everything I did. His eyes would shine ... As I spoke, he moved quickly with his head and said, "You're right, you're right." Those guys, Bigwigs Shipley and Feely, got all the credit. Earl Tudor has always called Bill Shipley a figure. He sent his female named Flash to a black man to cross paths with the red Jerry dog. He explained to his black friend how to cross this female. He would then smile like no angel and say, they were English Don dogs. Everyone knows a lot about these Irish dogs, and in fact they are good. But English dogs were great. Red-eyed dogs, as red as a ruby. Very hot wild dogs that would eat up to one person. And I said, I understand. Meanwhile, Earl Tudor's wife pulled her long cotton dress. She lowered her socks to her ankles, so she could show off her dog bite scars. Earl Tudor smiled and said, "Earl Flo was bitten 2 or 3 times, trying to separate some dogs that escaped when I wasn't home. I got to the point of talking to her, staying home and letting them fight to the death, so that she would no longer be bitten. So she said, 'Son of those dogs, Henry, they had a big mouth. You had to hit them in the head with a piece of iron for them to let go.'" Earl Tudor said, "Yes, she's telling the truth. I would leave her with no iron bar or a hammer in her hand if any of them would bite. She was allowed to hit him in the head and kill him. She's a sweetheart and a great Sheila. I don't know how I could have done that without her help." Flo was a small woman, 1.5 meters high, about 40 pounds high. Earl Tudor was also a small man, about 53 kilograms old. He said he would have been a fighter if he hadn't been shot in the belly once. He said that Bert was a stronger fighter than him, but he was like the sun above the mountain. I never hurt Bert, but he hurt me. We talked about creation. Earl Tudor bore the name of the famous king, who was known by the name of Henry, who was the first in Europe. In 1400, in England, the way was open to the only survivor with the strength to take and maintain the throne. Henry Tudor was a descendant of John Tudor. He spent half his life in Wales and the rest on the continent. He found the strength to join him when he landed at Milford Haven. He led them to England. King Richard met them at Market Bosworth near Leicester on the 22nd of August 1485. The first battle was between guard dogs, who were bred to fight. The royal army was larger, but it fought with less conviction. Many names Richard trusted had already decided to abandon him and go to the desert. Richard himself put dogs to fight bravely, but received little respect for it. The crown of England found in a bush was placed on the head of Henry Tudor, and the dead king's corpse was thrown on a horse and carried without ceremony to Leicester. The last one had left and the stage was set for the Tudors. The mark of the Tudors was a dog and a dragon. Earl Tudor never told me he was from this English family of Tudors, but he had the same round eyes as the pictures of the Tudor of England. He had the courage to breed a line of dogs until the last days of his life. In 1977, in the last 2 years of his life, Earl Tudor became a difficult man to live with, due to the hatred he carried within him. He kept a pistol in his pocket in the sun and cried a lot in the last years of his life. He told me stories about bad men he knew who always stopped and visited him when they came through eastern Texas in western Oklahoma, where rocks rise from the ground in rows as if they had been planted. Poor land that at this time is too poor to grow weeds. He told me about a time he spent in court while on trial for murder. He told me stories about life and about Pitbull dogs, which can only be told in one book. Earl Tudor was a man who liked all of us, and who kept only 2 types of dogs, those he liked, and those a friend gave him. He began raising his family of dogs in 1908 after living with them throughout his childhood. His first dog to fight was a dog son of Henry named Jack Swift. He crossed Henry with a dog named Black Star and produced a dog named Judge. He was tried for 60 years, always proving the value of his dogs and that they were real. The certainty is that this creation has been unbeatable over the years. It was like a river that never dried up. In Earl Tudor's adult life, he was a smuggler in a city, and his friend, Jim Williams, was a law enforcement officer. Jim always raised his females at Earl Tudor's house, and it was Jim Williams who took Earl Tudor's last breeder out of his backyard. Jim and Earl Tudor lived 30 miles away on the same road. They were just another example of two friends who got to the point of hating each other with dog business, but were friends until the end of Earl Tudor's life. Earl Tudor said that Jim was just a dog salesman, and Jim said, "I don't know why Earl Tudor speaks so badly of me." Jim could go and deal with Earl Tudor's dogs, and so he did for his entire life. Earl Tudor spoke of his life when he was a smuggler, and said he never gave a cigarette to the law, and yet he was not arrested in those years. Every time the men of the state went to town to try to arrest a smuggler, Jim would call Earl Tudor and tell him to close the store until the men of the state left the city. Earl Tudor met people like Pretty Boy, Floyd, Babyface Nelson, Frank Nash, who were raised a few miles from Earl Tudor at Badlands in Oklahoma when survival was hard. But like no Oklahoma preacher, Earl Tudor climbed high on his mountain and screamed like a rooster. After walking from Kentucky, when he was still a boy, he was riding in a cart pulled by oxen, but like a red-haired stranger, he rode to the Red Rock. With a black dog, he left his mark on the world of dogfighting, and as he said, "You can't hang a man by killing a woman who was stealing her horse." So that's where Earl Tudor lived, at the edge of his life, in the Oklahoma Badlands. He once told me that he won 24 fights in 24 months. Hell, there's no one who can win 24 consecutive fights, not even me. Then he smiled and punched me right and left on my chin. He was like the sun on the top of the mountain hitting his skin, like a lighthouse that stands alone. Earl Tudor traveled the roads of life in and around Oklahoma. At the same time, he had more than 100 hunting dogs and 200 roosters. He made his own spears with bed springs, but the game dog was the love of hate which he had of men. And like Dogmen's, looking for good fighting dogs, it's the same difficulty of finding a true friend in life after a man deals with life, in which men are having difficulty surviving in a land that is called bad. Earl Tudor shouted in pain on his massacred body as he lived one day at a time. He told me so many stories with so many different names of dogs that we talked about for days. He lived near the cemetery where his parents were interred, as he also wanted to be interred there to rest. But at the moment of God's grace we will all stand up and be counted. For sometimes I can hear his voice in spirit saying, "Go ahead, Don, go ahead." It was like taking a job and doing it. He said, "I'll do it my way." And he did, but I guarantee that his last years were the hardest I've ever seen. He told me, "Don, if a man told me he could win my dogs, I would tell him I would beat him in a short time, and I won." He told me. Once, we were against Figueroa. Shipley and his friends came with a veteran man a month before he died of old age. His name was Frumble of Arkansas. He was a good old man. I told him after the dogs were around, "I bet against your money it doesn't last 20 minutes. And at 18 minutes the dog of Figueroa fell dead in the center of the ring. Old Frumble was the only man who saw what I did. He shook my hand and told me, "I'm happy to meet a child from Oklahoma before he dies." He hugged my neck and left. It's sad. I saw what you did. I saw it. Earl Tudor just smiled and said he was quite a man. Then he got up and sat down again. Every time we visited there, he told a lot of stories of dogs, with many different dog names. Earl Tudor raised the dogs Henry as pure as possible, crossed paths with the Feely and Shipley families. From their analysis of the different struggles he saw in his life, Dabo was a dog bred for 41 years of Earl Tudor's life. In the Dabo pedigree for 8 generations, the 3 most appearing men were Earl Tudor of Oklahoma 39 times, Com Feely of Illinois 36 times, Bill Shipley of Texas 24 times. Compared to these 3 men, the others in the Dabo pedigree were hunting dog eaters. These 3 men were at the center of the dog struggle, where only the truth was. Gordon's female, Red Lady, was a female raised in the United States, where Tudor's name appears 38 times on her pedigree. When Earl Tudor crossed Dabo with Red Lady, his name appeared on his children's pedigree Jeff, Spike and Buck 77 times. In the Black Widow pedigree, Earl Tudor's name appears 69 times. When he crossed Spike with Black Widow, his name appeared on Baby's pedigree 146 times. He then raised Spike's brother, the Jeff dog, with the Baby female and thus produced Nigger, who was his last and purest male breeder. Earl Tudor's name appeared on Nigger's pedigree 223 times. He then crossed the Nigger with his sister and produced a single female, called the Spooky. The name of Earl Tudor appeared on his pedigree for 146 times. These 2 American game dogs were the purest breed of Earl Tudor's experience of the world of dog fighting, which he participated in for nearly 67 years of his life. And right now, after you're dead, there are still some of your friends trying to take away your creative credit.